Hello and welcome once again. My name is Pastor Shane Okimoto with Waikia Baptist Bible Church. And this is not the midweek sermon for July 22nd, 2020, but it is July 22nd, 2020. And this is part of the midweek sermon series. It's not going to be an actual sermon, but we are about halfway through the book of Ezra. I'm about halfway through the sermons that I'm planning to preach through Ezra. And I thought this would be a good time to kind of catch us up and recap everything that's happened in chapters 1 through 6, as well as, kind of provide the time frame all at once, because the timeline can be kind of confusing, especially in the book of Ezra and a lot of Old Testament books, New Testament books as well. But please, if you haven't done so already, feel free to go back and catch up on the sermons. They're all stored together under a playlist, Sermons, Ezra. You can catch up with that before we get back into Ezra chapter 7 next week. I began preaching this series back on June 17th, and the last one that I posted was last week on July 15th. I only preach from select passages. I'm not preaching it exactly verse by verse, and so I would highly encourage you to go and read this on your own. It'll only take you maybe 20 to 30 minutes to read through the book of Ezra. There's only 10 chapters. And if you're like me, it can be even faster, because once I get to this long list of names and numbers, I tend to kind of skip over it and just browse through it. Don't tell anybody that I said that. But yeah, I kind of just skim through it. But let me take you back to give you just kind of some historical setting on everything that's going on. And I'm taking us back to 586 BC. So that's over 2,000 years ago. But in 586 BC, this is known. What happened was the fall of Jerusalem. The Babylonians had overtaken Jerusalem, and after they overtook Jerusalem, they dragged all of the Jews into captivity in Babylon. And they've been in captivity for quite some time, because when we enter the first chapter of Ezra, this is the end of the Babylonian captivity, because the Persians have overtaken Babylon, and the Persians are now in charge, and Cyrus is the one in charge. And this happens in 539 BC. And one of the first things that Cyrus does is he puts out a decree, which is known as the Edict of Cyrus, or the Cylinder of Cyrus, allowing all the Jews to be released from captivity and allowing them to go back to Jerusalem, rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. And this shows that God is moving all around his people, even and especially in one of the world powers, the kings of one of these great world powers, King Cyrus. And so that's basically what happens in chapter 1. In chapter 2, it's one of those long lists of names and numbers. I didn't preach any sermon out of there, but it's still worth taking a look at. Chapter 3 sees the Jews arriving back in Jerusalem and starting the rebuilding process. And one of the things that they understood that they had to do was they had to make sure that they laid the proper foundation. And the most important foundation is the spiritual foundation. We see them doing that in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, what we see is the work of God continuing, but as it so often does, worldly opposition rears its ugly head, trying to stop the work of the Lord. And in chapter 4, we see that the Jews succumb to this worldly opposition, and the work is stopped for about 15 to 20 years until we get to chapter 5. This takes place in 520 BC after King Darius comes into power, and it's during his second year when he's in power. God had raised up a couple of prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, to go and preach to the people and let them know, hey, you can't let this work remain unfinished. You need to make sure that you get back to work doing what the Lord has called you to do. This showed that God continued his work through his people. Even though this work had been laying dormant for quite some time, God continues his work through his people. He doesn't give up on his people. He continues to work through them and in them. And last week, the last sermon that I preached out of chapter 6 takes place in 516 BC. And this is the completion of the temple after 4 hard years of work from the time they restarted. And doesn't even include whatever they did before that. But the culmination of all their work and the celebration of the completion of the temple, as well as a celebration of the first Passover that happened right after the temple was built. And so just a wonderful time of celebration. We're going to get back into Ezra chapter 7 starting next week, but we'll give the Jews another week to celebrate everything that God had accomplished through them. And next week when we get into chapter 7, what we're going to see is, if you noticed in the first 6 chapters, there wasn't anybody named Ezra. Next week is the first time that we're going to see Ezra arrive on the scene. And he's going to make some reforms, going to do some very important things. And when he arrives, it's actually going to be in 458 BC, so about 60 years after the completion and celebration of the temple. So we'll get back into that next week. But, I love the sermons. I love just the entire Old Testament, the stories that God has used in his people, the things that he's doing through his people, and how it doesn't just relate to them back then, but how it continues to relate to us today. So I encourage you, catch up on the sermons. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and read it on your own, because it fills in a lot of the gaps. And I know that you may have some questions, especially on the timeline, what's going on, who's who. You're welcome to comment on any of the videos. I'll be sure to do my best to answer any of the comments, or feel free to email me or get in touch with me and ask me those questions as well. But I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, and if hopefully I'll see you even before then. Maybe you'll see me come Sunday. But thank you for being here today. I love you folks, and I look forward to seeing you folks again.